time to start organising you for groups yet. We're actually interviewing for a new professor, as I told you last week. That still hasn't been decided, and other stuff like that getting in the way. But there's plenty of time. You don't have to start doing the group assessments or presenting until early January. So probably either next week or the week after. But again, the best thing is to meet people in the group, get to know people you'd like to work with collectively, nominate groups to me rather than me having to say who you guys go and you just randomly allocating you. So keep on thinking about it, meet up with each other, have coffee, decide if you'd like to work with each other, and then you can come and tell me in a week or two and we start actually organising who the groups are. So having done last week the mainstream, what I want to do today is talk about a related group, the Austrian economists. Now, I'm lumping together some people that Austrian economists don't regard as Austrian economists. Okay? I'll be talking about a guy called Joseph Schumpeter, who is Austrian, who was for a while Minister of Finance in the Austrian government back in the early, I think, 1910s, 1920s. He's clearly got the same intellectual framework, but a lot of them reject him as an Austrian. I will be talking a lot about Hayek. He's the guy I gave you that Keynes-Hayek rap in the first lecture. And if I have to identify a key question that they ask, it's this one about how does innovation and change occur? Think about the Neoclassicals. It was how do you reach equilibrium in a number of different markets? This is a very different question, just as legitimate in its own way as the one the Neoclassicals start from. They've got lots of common features. They talk about utility maximising behaviour and things of that nature. They talk about profit maximising and so on. They think in terms of supply and demand. So those are commonalities. But they evolved because they thought that what the mainstream focused upon, out of that vision of supply and demand, was the wrong sorts of abstractions. So what the mainstream does is do supply and demand to say, let's assume all products are the same. Okay, so you guys haven't got iPhones, you haven't got Samsungs, you've just got phones, mobile phones. And you don't drive Fords and you don't drive Vauxhalls and Audis and so on, you drive cars. Okay, that's ignoring the diversity inside products. The Austrians say that's the wrong thing to do. If you want to understand how capitalism works, you've got to look at the diversity of products, not bury it in this idea of homogeneity. So they also satirise quite viciously the way in which neoclassicals try to handle what we know about the present, the past, and what we can know about the future, what we can guess about the future. They think the neoclassicals talk about perfect knowledge. You'll see that if you look at a micro textbook, you'll see talking about perfect information. Well, they say it's nonsense. There's no such thing. So rather than focusing upon ignoring the fact that we don't know a lot about the present, let alone anything about the future, they say we have to focus upon what we don't know. And what they see the market as is not a way of getting a perfect equilibrium, but a way of coming together and combining the very, I don't want to use the word imperfect, the very limited knowledge we have of the present to get some sort of overall idea of what may happen over time. And they reject the mathematical approach that neoclassicals use. Not completely. I'll talk about the ways in which there is compatible to have mathematics in Austrians, but in general they do just reject mathematical thinking. And they regard, rather than talking about the equilibrium of supply and demand, to them the interesting stuff is when they're not the same. Okay? When the amount that's demanded by customers is different to what's being supplied, that's where they see opportunities turning up. And rather than talking about equilibrium, they try to explain cycles. But unlike the group I'll talk about next week, post-Keynesians, they see those cycles as being some extent caused by government intervention. And they also see money as playing an essential role. Again, I have criticisms of how they handle the idea of money. I think their model of money is wrong. But unlike the neoclassicals, they think you've got to include money in your thinking. So that's a broad overview of how they differ from the mainstream. These slides are going to have lots of words in them. So if you're taking notes, you're going to get a sore hand. My apologies. Do take the notes. It does help you clarify. Again, as I said, because you've seen for the previous lectures, I'll put the recording of the lecture up on my Patreon channel, linking through Canvas, and I'll do the same place you can download the slides as well. So the detail I put there is to give you some background rather than expecting you to absorb it all in one lecture today. Final little point, they're anti-government, quite strongly anti-government. So, the key difference, I think if you had to identify how they differ from this very related school of the Neoclassicals, it's the whole idea of knowledge. And they see Neoclassicals as making absurd assumptions. And I agree with them completely. Absurd assumptions to handle the fact that we don't know a lot of information about the world we live in, let alone what the future of the world is going to be. So how do Neoclassicals cope with that? I think this is legitimately describable as insane assumptions, not simplifying, insane. This is the Nobel Prize winner Gerard de Breu in a book called, I think, Mathematical Economics, and he makes this assumption. He says, for a producer, a production plan, brackets, made now for the whole future. In other words, on one moment in time, he's assuming every producer sits down and plots out everything they're going to produce for the next 1,000,000 years. And I'm not joking. They have to work with the idea of an infinite future. And there's the certainty assumption. Now look at this one. The certainty assumption implies that he knows what input-output combinations will be possible in the future, though he might not know the technical details of that. So let's assume sometime in the future, a couple of 100 years from now, we invent fusion technology. And fusion technology means you've got to buy deuterium and tritium to run your power plant. So this power producer knows that, say, in the year 2060, 2070, the orders for coal have to be replaced by orders for tritium and deuterium. That's total nonsense. Okay? But it's just an absurd way to handle uncertainty about the future. And then even when he talks about uncertainty, this is another classic. He says, we work out how to handle uncertainty by definition about a commodity that gives us a result that's exactly the same as if we assume certainty. Now, this stuff passes conventional economics referees. And it's a sign to me of the insanity of the mainstream that this sort of stuff gets through. And in this particular point on the Austrians, I'm probably a stronger critic of this stuff than they are. Now, Hayek, on the other hand, his lecture he gave when he was given the Nobel Prize. Oh, by the way, if you saw who won the Nobel Prize, did you notice that news on Monday? Okay, 2 winners of the Nobel Prize. One, a guy called Paul Romer, whom I'm quite fond of. I don't mind him getting one. A guy called William Nordhaus. I'm not so happy about him getting a Nobel Prize. So I'm actually going to create what I'm calling the Nobel Prize in economics as of next year. Nobble. You know what nobbling is? It's doping a horse so the favourite fails to win the race and your nag comes through and you make a profit by ripping off all the other punters. That's what nobbling is all about. So I think this stuff is nobbling economics rather than advancing it. But here is Hayek talking about what we know and says that we do not know what's going to happen that's going to bring about a change in how we do things today, an adaptation. It's impossible because everything is interdependent. So the whole idea of a new source of power comes down to a range of technologies that the person even working for that power doesn't yet themselves know. So we might well build fusion reactors. It might well involve some knowledge about electromagnetism we currently don't have, or quantum fluctuations, or God knows what. So we only have a tiny amount of the knowledge now. Each of us only knows a tiny amount of what's necessary today. We have to fit into a particular framework where what we know fits into what somebody else knows and something works. Okay? So what he's focusing upon is the incompleteness of our knowledge and how the market is a way of getting around that incompleteness, which is a very different approach to the way that the Neoclassicals talk about it. So he said what we have is a whole lot, little bits and pieces of knowledge that in various ways the market aggregates. So, for example, if you're trying, let's say you come up with a new idea for a skateboard. That new idea for a skateboard will build on the ideas other people already have that you take for granted. You might not know how somebody makes ball bearings. You might know of somebody who makes it perfectly smooth, and this actually exists. The smallest circular molecule in existence was invented by a Norwegian engineer for the sheer fun of seeing how small could he make the sphere. And that is like, it's so tiny, of course, you can't see it. Even with you can barely see it under microscopes. But this stuff is replacing all the ball bearings you're seeing in things like skateboards. So you could say, I'm going to take that fluid, put it into a skateboard, and get skateboards that work much more effectively. That sort of thing. You don't even know how the person made this particular molecule, but you know it exists. and you can put it together in a new product. That's the sort of thing that Hayek is looking at. So it's not the sort of stuff you can plan. And he said, if you look at what the Neoclassicals talk about as equilibrium today, and that meeting of supply and demand and then projecting it through time, it requires an impossible level of knowledge. The concept of equilibrium can be made definite and clear only in terms of assumptions concerning foresight, the capacity to foresee the future. And he says, you can define like an individual being in equilibrium given their budget tastes now for a single isolated individual. But if you want to talk about equilibrium for the entire economy, what it means is everybody's plans to do things have to be consistent with everybody else's plans. Now, neoclassicals literally assume that's possible. And Hayek said that's totally impossible. There's no way that all our plans can be consistent with everybody else's plans. So because our plans depend on what other people's do, our plans will not succeed. We might over-succeed or under-succeed with our objectives, depending on what other people are planning to do, which we depend upon. We don't know what they're going to do. So our plans involve not just plans for now, but plans for the future. And the only way to get those plans to all work out and reach equilibrium is if all the plans are consistent, which is impossible. It's only possible if everybody's plans are the same and expectations are the same and correct. And this is what Hayek then says we do. We're really passing into a different sphere and silently introducing a new element of an altogether different character when we apply to explanations the interaction of individuals what we apply to a single individual. Okay? You simply can't do that. But that's what the neoclassicals do, to jump over this problem that what we do today depends upon what we think is going to happen in the future. And the only way that what we do today is going to work out as we expect is if everybody else shares exactly the same expectations about the future. And those expectations are right, which they can't possibly be. So some of the things he said about how economists abuse the notion of knowledge was said before some of the more extreme examples of neoclassical thought came through. So he's saying equilibrium is a relation between actions. It isn't just a single. You can think about the abstraction of a single person, demand and supply in isolation, and work out equilibrium for that individual. But to get equilibrium in an overall system, everything has to be self-consistent, and it's just not the way capitalism is. Yeah. Pardon? Up now on Canvas. You mind taking a 2-minute break while I do that? That's a good idea. So give me 2 minutes, and I'll do that straight away. I take the point. Partly what he's saying here is an important technical point. If you're going to talk about equilibrium, you have to have time. If you don't have time in your model, fundamentally you haven't got a sensible concept of equilibrium. Now you think about the supply and demand diagrams you do in microeconomics, and there's no mention of time there. Physical supply of a particular time, but there's no mention of a flow of supply through time, which should be part of how they model equilibrium and time properly. So it's meaningless. And so to be in time, for equilibrium to apply when you look at a whole lot of people and a whole lot of markets and goods, expectations have to be shared and correct. He says the concept of equilibrium merely means the foresight of different members of society is in a special sense correct. Now look at what I showed you for De Breu a short while ago. And he's saying people are accurately predicting what they're going to need as inputs in the far distant future to make the goods they're currently making, which is madness. You simply don't have that level of knowledge. So, therefore, to have this idea of equilibrium, all these plans have to be accurately coordinated. And there've got to be expectations on external fact that mean that people have no reason to change their plans. One of my favourite lines from a rock and roll song is from John Lennon, and the song is, "Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans." And you know that in your own self. You'll be always thinking about what's hypothetically going to happen at tomorrow's party or tonight's drinks or tomorrow's exam, and bang, and you build a fictional world, and you get in your mind, you get there. What happens is the opposite, not the opposite, completely different to what your expectations are. That's life. And what the Austrians are saying, we have to take that into account in how we model it. So you can't get the equilibrium the Neoclassicals talk about, unless everybody knows everything. And they say the statement that if people know everything, then they're in equilibrium is true because that's how you define equilibrium. But and the assumption of a perfect market is effectively assuming everybody's right about not just the current price but the future, the direction things are going to go in. So if we're going to make those assertions, we have to explain how they're going to get that knowledge. Now his point is you simply can't get that knowledge. But what the market does is the market is the best way of aggregating what little we know to make some sense. Okay? So it's a more modest expectation about people's knowledge, much more realistic, and it's a more modest view of what the market does, but also much more realistic. So he said when Neoclassicals, Hayek is fairly verbose, more so than Keynes. That didn't come through in the rap, but it's true when you read their works. But what he's saying here in the usual presentations of equilibrium, it's made to appear as though we've solved all those questions about how we reach that equilibrium. And the device is this idea of a perfect market where every event becomes known instantaneously to every member. And think about the assumption of perfect knowledge if you're going through the idea of perfect competition right now. But this has to be applied to everything. The whole system must be assumed to be one perfect market in which everybody knows everything. He's saying that's just absurd. You can't assume what the market is actually a means to achieve an approximation to. So the economic man has returned in the form of a quasi-omniscient individual. And again, if you look at what's talked about by rational expectations and the idea of Arrow de Breu idea of markets, it's all about us being omniscient. Now, if we're all knowing and all seeing, why do we need a market? Okay. That's a failure of neoclassical economics, that it pretends that we're gods. And if we're gods, who needs a market? So neoclassicals, even though they were writing long after Hayek, ended up doing what Hayek said they had to do to make their theories appear to be consistent. How do they think people acquire accurate foresight? Well, this is a guy called Muth, who originated the idea of rational expectations, which you'll learn about when you do macro. He said, I should like to suggest that expectations, since they are informed prediction of future events, are essentially the same as the predictions of the relevant economic theory. So in other words, they pretend that economic theory lets us predict the future, and then anybody who can predict the future using economic theory is rational, and then anybody who doesn't use economic theory to predict the future is irrational. Which is just madness. And equally this idea of information. He says information is scarce and the economic system generally does not waste it. And that's a part of the argument they give for rational expectations. But if you look at that, if information is scarce, then it should have a cost. Okay? If it has a cost, you're not going to buy enough information to know everything. So therefore, that is a reason to say information is incomplete. But they simply make that statement and roll forward. It's internally inconsistent. If information is scarce, it'll have a cost. A rational person will pay until the marginal cost equals the marginal benefit. We won't be using all information, but the neoclassicals assume we have all the information and use it, and it's costless. Again, quite insane. But there's no other way to describe this sort of thinking, which is one reason why what you get taught at Kingston is very different to what you get taught at other universities. So Austrians see the market succeeding not because people have these omniscient expectations, but because it takes the limited knowledge of millions and millions of people and brings about something which is a reasonable approximation to good knowledge. So the problem we pretend to solve is how the spontaneous interaction of a number of people, each possessing only bits of information, brings about an affair in which prices correspond to costs. Now here I think to some extent Austrians are cheating because they've rejected the idea that we're omniscient, but they're saying the market gets us very close to being omniscient. Now in fact, more realistic is to say we're not omniscient, so the market will get us to somewhere which is far from equilibrium. Okay? Not close. And then you've got to say what happens when you're out of equilibrium, which they don't properly do. And what he says is experience shows that something of this sort does happen. The empirical observation that prices do tend to correspond to costs was the beginning of our science. So in some ways he's fudging it a bit here. But he says we have to show what bits of information the different people possess bring about that result. And what the neoclassicals do is evade that whole problem. They assume we have this perfect knowledge to start with. And the question is, how does the market accumulate knowledge that we have over time? So even though they're criticising the idea of equilibrium, they still tend to pretend that we're very, very close to equilibrium. We bring all these fragments together. We get a level of knowledge that no individual mind possesses coming out of the market itself. And this is a classic statement. The spontaneous actions of individuals, and again it's verbose, will under conditions which we can define bring about a distribution of resources which can be understood as if it were made according to a single plan. Now there's partly one of the things I think is a problem with this whole, the neoclassicals and the Austrians in general, as if it were made according to a single plan. So in some ways he's ended back at the point he's criticising. Now what you should really be saying was, given how incomplete our information is, we're going to be a long way from a coordinated position. But it's then the dynamics of how we change from one uncoordinated position to another that matters, out of equilibrium dynamics. That's what we should be doing, and he's not doing it properly. How do we know this statement is saying that prices correspond to costs? But it's still a realistic criticism of what the neoclassicals have as a concept of knowledge, which is just absurd. And they also criticise, and this here I think are on much stronger grounds, criticising what neoclassicals call competition. Because the neoclassical model of competition presumes you've got a homogeneous product, so you all just buy phones, there's no product differentiation. Samsung and Apple happen to be different competitors all producing an identical product. And it's the question of price is the only differentiation between the two. That's just not at all what you guys are doing. You think about your decision to buy a phone. It's a whole lot of things about the relative advantages of one particular different phone to another different phone. Do you want to go with the ecosystem of all the Apple apps, or do you want to get the better screens of Samsung and things like this? Do you want to have a better camera? All these decisions. It's all about the diversity of what you're looking at. They assume free entry into the market and the absence of any restraints. Nope. It's not free to move into a market like phones. It's an enormous cost. You could go bankrupt in the process. They consume complete knowledge. We all know everything about what's possible in the phone market. We don't. So here is Hayek saying the peculiar nature of the assumptions are clearly weak if we ask, is this what competition really is? Is competition a bunch of firms all producing an identical product and fighting only over price? Or is competition a bunch of firms with very different products competing in a general product area by differentiation? It's clearly the latter. That's what competition really is, and that's what the Austrians focus upon. So Apple and Samsung phones aren't homogeneous, nor are cars. Okay. And do they compete on price? Do Ford and Ferrari compete on price, or are they competing for different market segments at far different prices? So non-homogeneity and non-price competition are the rule, they're not the exception. And that's what the neoclassicals leave out, whereas the Austrians, to some extent, focus upon it. And they have an evolutionary idea of what competition is. It's not a question of getting the right marginal costs and stuff like that. It's what satisfies particular niches in the marketplace. And it's a voyage of exploration into the unknown. So if you think about Apple, when Apple first produced the iPhone, that was a market they'd never been in before. Okay? It's an adventure into the unknown. Will this work, or will they be wiped out by the established phone companies like Nokia? Okay, what happened? Of course, Nokia doesn't exist anymore. An attempt to discover new ways of doing things better than they've done before. And this must, all economic problems are created by unforeseen changes which require adaptation. So it's an evolutionary view of what competition is. So the market is a place where differentiated products compete, and the competition is largely by adaptive change over time. And what you get is an evolution, a co-evolution of consumer tastes and the goods themselves. So if you go back to the original mobile phones, which were about, about two of those together, the original mobile phones, they were bricks. They used to call them the mobile brick. One of my friends was one of the designers of the very first mobile phones, a company called Motorola. And they were literally the size of a brick, and they could make a telephone call and that's it. Now, if you offered a phone that only made phone calls, would you buy it today? Okay. You expect video communication. You expect music playing, high quality music. You expect a damn good camera. You're expecting pretty soon 3D cameras. So all this co-evolution of the product and the consumer is an essential part of real competition. And to some degree, not enough, that's what Austrians focus upon. And when it comes to how they technically model, they're anti-mathematical. But I want to point out that Austrians take their anti-mathematical stance too far. So this is Hayek. I think this is in his Nobel Prize lecture. I want to give the impression that I generally reject mathematical methods. He said there are advantages to mathematical methods. Patterns we can't actually see without putting things in mathematical form and so on. So that does matter. And we couldn't have achieved the level of understanding we have without those mathematical ideas. So he's not rejecting mathematics entirely. He said that the main problem of applying maths to the economy is that it's a complex system. And he was one of the first to use that phrase, describing the economy as a complex system. And therefore he says that we can't actually fully describe the economy because it's a complex system. And he says a complex system is something made up of lots and lots and lots of individual parts. Now, he wrote that before mathematicians developed an idea of what they call complexity. And they found the opposite of what Hayek thought was complexity. They thought, he thought complexity meant lots and lots of parts, like a really complicated watch. Okay? A watch is very complicated, but it's not complex, because a watch works like clockwork. It gives you exactly the same time pattern all the time. So it isn't that something has got lots of parts. It's the second thing he's focusing upon here, the manner in which individual elements are connected with each other. And what we've found in what's called complex systems mathematics, or complex systems analysis, is that you don't need lots and lots of complicated parts to have a complex system. You simply need simple systems which interact with each other in non-additive ways. Now, I know that's going to sound a bit strange, but I'm going to want to show why Hayek was both right and wrong. So he's right to say the economy is a complex system. And he's also right to say it's a product of how different parts of the system interact with each other. But he's wrong to say it's confined just to physical sciences, to social sciences. It also occurs in physical sciences like meteorology. And he's wrong to say it's got to have lots and lots of parts. Instead, what we've found in complex systems, the rule is that you have a simple system, a few components, but complex behaviour coming out of a few components. And the reason you get complex behaviour is because the interactions aren't like adding things together. If I have an additive process, all I'm going to say is add the weights of these two together, and I could add lots and lots of small bits of weight together, and I'm just simply adding the same characteristic. But it tends to be things multiplying, pushing against each other. Multiplication, not just addition. And I can show you the simplest possible example of that with a discovery of what's called the butterfly effect by a guy called Lorenz back in 1963. And he was a mathematician in meteorology when mathematicians were doing basically two things to try to predict the next day's weather. One was they'd simply use linear models, so they'd project forward what's happening today to tomorrow. The other is they do pattern matching. They'd look for previous sets of days which had the same sequence of temperatures and then say, well, we think the next day we have these 5 days in a row, same sort of temperatures occurred 40 years ago. The next day the temperature was 13 degrees, so our prediction for tomorrow was 13 degrees, pattern matching. And Lorenz said, look, that doesn't work. We know that what's actually going on are highly non-linear things interacting with each other. You can't just do linear predictions. And you need to have a model that has those non-linearities as part of it. So this is the model that Lorenz had of the weather system. I'll show you a simulation of this in a moment. So if you take a look at it, it has 3 constants, beta, rho, and sigma. Initial values of 0, starting from, I'll explain what x, y, and z are in a moment. And 3 equations. The rate of change of x is y minus x multiplied by sigma. The rate of change of y is x multiplied by rho minus z minus y. And the rate of change of z is x times y minus beta times z. Now I've just actually verbally described the whole model, okay? It's really quite simple. There's only you only got 3 variables and 3 parameters, 6 parts to it. Extremely simple. How does it behave? It has incredibly complicated behaviour because according to Hayek, that could not be a complex system because it's only got a few parts. Okay? Very few parts. So it couldn't give you complex behaviour. What a meteorologist found was that it actually did have complex behaviour. So I'll show you now. That's it in equilibrium. Nothing happens. Okay? Out of equilibrium, that's what happens. So complexity comes out of simple interactions. I'll show you that happening live in a moment. Let's just take a look. Okay. So here's the model. And this is simulating it in a software package I've designed. I didn't program it, by the way. I'm not the coder for this sort of stuff, but I design software. And this is, I'll just move that around a bit. You can download this for free from SourceForge. I'll give you all the link later. But this is showing exactly the same equations I've shown you beforehand. I don't think I can make, I guess zoom in here, let's see. Okay, so those are the equations I showed you a moment ago. And the way they're done in the program is a class of programs called system dynamics. It shows up as a flowchart. If I simulate this in equilibrium, I get a flat line. The x, the y, and the z variables, it's just flat, it's 0. If I plot the y against the x and the x against the z, I get just a dot in the middle. Nothing is changing. Now, what if I just give a tiny shock? Great. Plug in the software. Okay, let's reload that. Pardon me. I've got to show that to my programmer later. Let's go back again. And I'll just start the whole thing with a tiny shock here. And give it one time step. Oh dear, this is great. Okay, let's go and load another version of it. Maybe that's the embedded version of the program. I'll load one from my computer. Hang on a second. Okay. Hope this doesn't crash. Let's see. Okay, that's a more complicated model. And I think I'm starting slightly out of equilibrium. Let's see what happens. Okay, this is the sort of behaviour you get out of equilibrium. Fluctuations all the time. If you look at this one here, it looks like it's all random, just up and down, no particular pattern at all. If you look at the interaction of 2 variables against each other, you get what looks like the wings of a butterfly. Now, that's incredibly complicated behaviour out of an incredibly simple model. That's what a complex system is. So Hayek was wrong about what is a complex system. And it doesn't take lots of mathematics to do it. It's a very simple, cut-down version. We'll show you most of the turbulence that we see turning up in the weather system, because what Lorenz was doing here is using a hot plate on a stove as a basic model of turbulence in the atmosphere. The x and the y are where horizontal and the depth of the stove, and the z is the temperature difference, and the value you're seeing there is where's a drop of water going to be on the hot plate if you're heating it? Where's it going to move? And if you actually put a stove, you can try this back at home. You get a nice thick soup, like a pea soup or a pumpkin soup. Put it on the stove and put a very low temperature and slowly turn the temperature up. And what you'll start to see is cells start to form, rotational cells in the soup. And they're called Bernoulli cells. And this is the dynamics of a Bernoulli cell, very simplified version of that dynamic. So that's what a complex system is in the real world. And Hayek he was right. Yeah, sorry.
So the equations, they show consumer behavior.
Sorry, pardon me, my hearing being bad, sorry.
The equations, they show different consumer behavior.
Different consumer behavior? Yeah, you could do that. That's the idea. You could show, I wouldn't necessarily use a model like this to do things like saying how do consumers' behaviours change over time, but use a multi-agent model for that, as it happens, another way of handling complex systems. But I would be looking at things like interaction between the level of employment and how much wage demands are there, and then what that does to profit, what that does to debt, and what that does to economic cycles. So I do use it for that sort of work, but not specifically consumers. In that case, I'd want to have something which can evolve over time. Parameters changing, where here the parameters are constant. But the interesting thing is even with constant parameters, I get continuously changing behaviour, and that's the sign of a complex system. Thank you for that. I'll show you next week. I'll show you the multi-agent version of modelling as well. So they still believe you tend to equilibrium. Now I've shown you an incredibly simple system that doesn't reach equilibrium. So we know that it's false to believe you reach equilibrium, but it's correct to say you've got to look at what's happening out of disequilibrium. And they believe innovation would perturbate the system all the time. So without innovation, you'd reach equilibrium. In other words, with constant parameters, you'd reach equilibrium. That's wrong. But they're saying what the system does would inspire you to innovate and come up with new parameters or new approaches to tastes and concerns and so on. And the best person putting this out was Joseph Schumpeter. Now, this is the guy who is Austrian by birth, who's very similar to the other Austrians in how he thinks, but most Austrians reject him because he saw a role for government spending and things like that. So he was basically he's politically rejected by Austrians. I really think he's the best of the Austrians. And he wrote a book saying capitalism would give way to socialism as well, which is the last thing Austrians believe in. So he was rejected for political reasons. But I think, leave out the ideology, his methodology is very similar to Hayek's, and his focus on the role of the entrepreneur is also extremely useful. So I'll quickly start that, and I'll stop at about 5 minutes to and give you about a 10-minute break to take some of this in, and also to download the slides. So Schumpeter accepted the neoclassical vision of general equilibrium as describing an economy unchanging through time, that everybody's satisfied with the current situation. And he said profit is a surplus of the receipts, what you spend versus what you get versus what you spend. He said in equilibrium, that's got to be zero. Again, a little higher courses I'll show why that's not particularly correct, but from neoclassical thinking it is correct. Because if you're in equilibrium, then you're selling everything at marginal cost. Wages are equal to the marginal product of labour. Returns to capital to the marginal product of capital. Has profit to be zero. Okay. And you say, but obviously capitalism is driven by profit. So where does profit come from? If in equilibrium everything is zero. So profit has to come from disequilibrium. Now, I will criticise that in a later, but it's a good starting point. If you accept the neoclassical vision, then in equilibrium there's no profit. They talk about supernormal profits, but I think Schumpeter is much more realistic. So he says profit comes out of change. And the neoclassical model can't describe change because it's describing a state of rest. State of equilibrium is where no change occurs. And they ignore the process of change from one equilibrium to another. Now, what Schumpeter says is we've got to look at that process of change, and that's how we can explain where profit comes from and where pricing strategies come in as well. So we need a model of discontinuous change where equilibrium is disturbed, and while it's disturbed, somebody can make a supernormal profit. And I'll go finish this one slide, but we'll take a break at this stage. So he says neoclassical economics describes economic life from the point of view of a tendency towards equilibrium. And we get to work out prices and quantities that way. But they fail when there's change over time. Static analysis can't predict the consequences of discontinuous change. It can't explain productive revolutions and what goes along with them. It can only investigate a new equilibrium after all those changes have been settled. He said the interesting thing in capitalism is to explain those processes of change. Let's take a 10-minute break, come back at 5 past, and keep on going from there.